IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, Takshashila Institution's daily public policy podcast. I'm Anushka Saxena, a research analyst with the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program, and I'm joined by my colleague Amit Kumar, who's also a research analyst with the program. Welcome to the podcast, Amit.
Thank you, Anushka. Happy to be here.
Right. So, a few weeks ago, the leader of the Wagner group, a Russian private security military company, attempted a coup against Russian President Vladimir Putin. And the event was widely covered. And within 24 hours of Yevgeny Prighozin, who's the head of Wagner's announcement that he will take over the Kremlin, the Russian parliament, his attempts were put down without any bloodshed. Now, it is speculated that he is somewhere in Belarus, as the Belarusian Prime Minister Lukashenko played a major role in the negotiations between Putin and Prigozhin. And the Chinese state responded to this in a very muted manner. So, to begin with, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin, he stated that the matter is Russia's internal affair and does not in any manner demonstrate a challenge to the Russia-China no limits partnership. Subsequently, to prove this, various Chinese and Russian officials also held meetings and discussed the matter. These meetings, for example, were held between the chairperson of the Chinese National People's Congress, Zhao Liqi, and the Russian Federation Council Speaker, Valentina Matvienko. And there were other meetings between the Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu and the Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Navy, Admiral Nikolai Yevmenov. Parallelly, Chinese officials and analysts continued to downplay the Western narrative that Russia was shown to be weak from this coup attempt in any way, and went ahead and supported Russia in its quote-unquote resolute response to Prigozhin's mutiny. This brings us to not only discuss how China views the mutiny and what lessons it may have drawn from it, but also what China's own private military security infrastructure looks like. So, Amit, my first question to you, I guess, is what do you make of China's response to the Wagner incident? And do you think this has in any way contributed to a concern among Chinese policymakers surrounding Putin's perceived weakness and how that may have affected the so-called strategic axis between the two countries? Over to you.
Thank you, Anushka. According to me, this whole mutiny question in Russia against Putin, which was led by Prighozin, it was widely covered throughout the globe, right? And it raised concerns among various countries, and particularly in the West, which showed that this issue has somehow exposed Putin's weakness and his lack of grip over the security apparatus. But things were not it was not similarly viewed in China. So to begin with, if you ask me, what was the response in China? I think the first point that the Chinese put out was initially that, of course, they were concerned at the initial stages of the mutiny. But the point that they put out was that this is Russia's completely domestic issue and an internal matter. And as you have already pointed out, that there exists no limits partnership between China and Russia. There are, of course, a few red lines that both these countries do not wish to cross, right? So, for example, in case of China, Russia would not want to comment on the red line that China has drawn, that is on the issue of Taiwan. And similarly, likewise, China could not have been too critical of Russia to begin with, as it didn't want to embarrass its only ally. It doesn't use the word ally, but strategic partner that it has against the West in its attempt to challenge or subvert the Western-dominated or Western-led global order. So China was very careful in its response initially to begin with. And it outrightly commented that it is an internal and domestic matter of Russia, and that they hope that Russia will successfully maintain its internal stability. But as time passed by, we saw the narrative also started to, Chinese state media narrative became more assertive, and largely it carried the view that any talk or rumors surrounding Putin's weakness in the wake of mutiny, as it was circulated mostly within the Western circles, was a wishful thinking by the West and led by the US and the other US partners. And this was largely doing and this narrative was largely the Russian viewpoint as well. And this was largely seconding Russian viewpoint. And the message that was being conveyed here was that the fact that Putin managed to put down this mutiny within 24 hours demonstrates his grip on the military and domestic law and order, contrary to what was being highlighted in the Western media circles. And furthermore, the fact that Putin managed to put down the mutiny without any bloodshed or without any casualty. There were attacks on Russian aircrafts, but largely Putin was managed to avoid any bloodshed, especially of the civilians. And that it reinforced somehow that this whole episode has reinforced his grip on the security apparatus. And I would like to think that this view that was largely peddled by the Russians and China is what has now become common or accepted even among other nations, including India as well, that this whole episode has rather highlighted or demonstrated Putin's acumen. He took a tactical retreat, and that it showed that Putin was capable of stepping back and taking a tactical retreat in order to dial down the situation and demonstrate his grip over the security apparatus. So I think these are the narratives that this is how China responded, and I think rightly so. This argument holds some ground and some depth that Putin has emerged stronger in the aftermath of this mutiny. And so I think any insecurity that might have propped up within the Chinese leadership pertaining to the mutiny has subsided, and the Chinese are quite assured that Putin has total grip and firm grip over his internal order.
Right. So that's a very interesting assessment that you've made with regards to the differences in narratives on Prigozhin's mutiny vis-a-vis the West and China, and you mentioned to some extent India. And yeah, like you said, this argument holds some merit. And of course, the fact that Lukashenko came into the picture very quickly and the situation was nowhere to be seen or observed after 24 hours with everything going smoothly, both in terms of Wagner troops' involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war as well as the protection of civilians internally in Russia, seems to indicate that Chinese insecurities, if any, must have been quelled there and then. But I'd still like to reiterate some part of the question I asked you. Has the Wagner incident in any way impacted, say, China's thinking on, say, private security and military companies, on war, anything of the sort? What do you think Chinese President Xi Jinping may have learned from it, if anything? And do you think that the governance models that are in place in China, they're already resolute enough to prevent such a thing from taking place?
Yeah, so right, interesting question. So as soon as this event took place in Russia, and there were murmurs and questions around does Chinese leadership also have to fear about something of a similar sort within their in their country. And so I think it's important to first make a distinction between PMCs and PSCs. So PMCs, as we know, that it expands to private military companies, and PSCs are private security companies. So the main broad difference between these two companies is, while the PMCs are engaged in combat operations, PSCs are largely catered to provide security and on-site security, are largely involved in providing security and on-site security to certain projects, etc., etc. So this is a broad difference between the two. And keeping this in mind, I would like to, and in China, what is interesting is they have actually, through a legislation, banned PMCs, and PSCs was regularized and legalized in, I think, 2009. So what Chinese operate is actually PSCs and not PMCs. So there's some broad differences there. So in the context of China, it is important to point out that with respect to Wagner groups, unlike the Wagner Chinese, PSC is not a combat company. It largely caters to providing on-site security to companies and projects, even domestically and even abroad. Second, another way that the Chinese state maintains control over the PSCs is that a lot of these contractors who get into PSCs are former PLA soldiers, ex-special forces and paramilitary forces. As you know that in China, the post-retirement benefits to the PLA soldiers are not that great. And so PSCs gives them an opportunity wherein after having retired from PLA, they can have a employment opportunity. So a large chunk of these spots, the contractors' places are filled by former PLA soldiers. Then the second safeguard that the Chinese state maintains is that the state itself has some stake in the Chinese PSCs. So, this gives the Chinese state some sort of management role and control over the PSCs itself. And so they're constantly in loop and constantly take part in the decision making, what the PSCs make, right? And then there are also the Chinese PSCs, unlike the Wagner group, are also debarred from using ammunition or be involved in combat roles or use arms and rifles in a manner that the Wagner group does. They do not have access to the ammunitions that a group like Wagner or the PMC would have. So there are certain limitations with respect to Chinese PSCs. If you have to draw a parallel and suspect or speculate if such a situation could arise in China, you have to look at these factors, and these factors tell us that it is very difficult to imagine such a situation in China, that something of that sort could happen in China. And I think these are the broad factors that one needs to look at if one has to speculate on this issue.
Right. So just to follow up on what you said with regards to how these sort of firms that operate in and out of China are private security and not military companies. They're not combat forces. They're more of on-site protection and security forces. We also see some of them employed in, say, BRI projects in Pakistan and African countries. So I understand the point that you're making, that Wagner was only able to effect this coup because Russian forces were occupied in war. So there is no such situation in China also. So that way, the idea that such a thing might happen in China seems more and more distant. But still, like I said, I'd like to follow up with you. Can you throw some light on what Chinese private security company activity looks like? I believe it's a little more undocumented and understudied as compared to, say, how Russian or American private security or private military companies operate. We've seen so much work done on both Wagner and, say, American companies like Blackwater. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how these Chinese PSCs functions and where they're deployed.
So the question, to also add on to the previous question, the concern is not as much to the CPC with respect to the Chinese private security companies, but to the interest of its rival abroad in, say, Latin America or African countries or sub-Saharan countries. So according to estimates, China operates around 7,000 private security companies domestically. And according to a CSIS report, it says that around 30 to 40 of these Chinese PSCs are also have their operations in about 40 countries, outside, which operate outside China. And so this, because these PSCs do not have a status that is comparable to those of the PMCs, which cannot be employed as assistant to assist China's military, like the Wagner did during the Ukraine war. So, does not rule out the possibility that these Chinese PSCs cannot offer some geopolitical advantage to the Chinese state when they're operating outside. So a lot of these Chinese PSCs that we're talking about these odd 30 to 40 Chinese PSCs that operate abroad, they provide security to most of the Chinese BRI projects that have their presence overseas, mostly in Africa and sub-Saharan countries like Sudan and others. So these are the areas where they're mostly employed. And employing these, as I've said, they are not comparable to PMCs, but they are still boots on ground without putting boots on ground. So one of the advantage that this gives the Chinese state is we have seen how China has leveraged the security apparatus, even its personnel abroad, to benefit its domestic politics and even foreign policy, and they have employed it to give effect to their goals. So there's no reason one should not think that even the Chinese PSCs cannot be used by the Chinese state to give effect to some of their national or geopolitical goals. So what this does is that because by law, Chinese PSCs are not the part of the Chinese military or the Chinese government. It provides them the solution, a sense of deniability to and circumvent some of the international laws that might be applicable to national armies. So because these PSCs operate out of these international law that might be applicable to the national armies, it becomes easy for them. And because there's no direct link that can be traced to the Chinese state, it gives them a sense of deniability and carry out also influence and covert operations.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
And of course, that's definitely a concern when countries look at BRI projects also, right? They're concerned not just about economic coercive diplomacy or debt traps, but also that as soon as a BRI project would be launched in a certain country, it would invite all sorts of Chinese security firms to protect the projects and track their progress. It would, invite a lot of Chinese citizens. The workforce would be primarily Chinese, so they would be the ones who would be building the project, seeing it from front to back. And of course, it's up to how analysts see it, but some of them argue that this is how China expands its influence within the society where the BRI project has been offered, right? And in Central Asia, for example, we've seen a lot of these kind of protests against expanding Chinese diasporic presence and by extension influence in the region that comes with acceptance of more and more BRI investment. And increasingly now we might also see this as a contention being raised to some of the developmental infrastructure projects that China may offer under the Global Development Initiative, which can then be concurrently complemented by the sending off of private security companies under the Global Security Initiative. And then that would come as a package deal that the friends of GDI may not be able to refuse. So that brings up concerns of its own. So that's a valid point made with regards to the deniability and the covert nature of PSCs abroad.
Just to follow up, because first these PMCs, as you know, that they first propped up and the Western countries are the first to use them in their operations, and then followed by Russia. And now China has also started, although not PMCs, but still PSCs. So I wanted to ask you as to how China interacts with international law on these private security companies, or PMSCs, as you would like to call it.
Right. So, of course, if you remember, we've done a podcast on ATP before this as well, where we discussed in detail the applicability of international law to this gray area that we understand as private military security companies. And of course, interested listeners may want to refer to that for a more elaborate backgrounder on this. But in the context of the conversation we're having today, I think the ICRC which is the Red Cross Society, has a lot of role to play in interpreting international humanitarian and criminal law in the context of how PMCs and PSCs interact and operate during war. They've placed a lot of testament to the fact that these people interrupt the operations of the UN peacekeeping forces, which again, China is one of the largest contributor to the UN peacekeeping forces and has a great number of forces deployed in these African countries where perhaps their own PSCs are also operating. So it always runs a risk of their operations kind of interacting with each other and even influencing each other's operations drastically. So that's always a concern that ICRC has advocated for and has written a lot, discussed a lot about the applicability of current international legal structures on how PMSCs function. With regards to how China would maybe see this, is that so there's a document known as the Montreux document that came out in 2008, which is kind of the fruit of a joint initiative by the government of Switzerland and the ICRC on the subject of PMSCs. It sprang from a desire to bring governments together that are most affected by PMSCs in order to discuss an international legal framework that can govern their activities, of which so far none exactly exists. But like I said, ICRC has been advocating for it. So again, the initiative was also for states that use a lot of PMSCs in war and in African or sub-Saharan countries to respect international humanitarian law and human rights law by PMSCs, because again, apart from disrupting UN peacekeeping efforts, what the operations of such PMSCs do in war zones is that because they have to fulfill a certain geopolitical objective provided by, say, a state or their private employer, they can run roughshod over human rights. They can kill as many civilians without accountability or have civilian targets in mind without really respecting the laws of war. So these issues and initiatives led to the formulation of what we know as the Montreux document. And what China's role here has been is that 17 governments were involved in the development of the document. It was these states that helped draft the document and invite accountability from countries across the world. And China was one of them, along with, of course, a lot of African countries, countries like Sweden, and countries you wouldn't expect, like France and the UK, that have had a history of operating PMSCs, even the US that have had a history of operating PMSCs in African countries, right? And apart from that, in 2019, I believe the China University of Political Science collaborated with ICRC and organized a forum on security and law, legal regulations on security industry, so on and so forth. And that conference yielded a lot of results on both the Chinese internal architecture and PSMCs and how China interacts with international law and on the subject, right? So there were representatives from Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, African countries. There were about 200 participants. This happened in the Yunnan province. And the main objective, like I said, was to facilitate and contribute to the adoption of a regulatory framework for the Chinese PMSCs deployed abroad, in particular in situations of armed conflict and other situations of violence, right? And representatives from ICRC, the International Code of Conduct Association, the Montreux Document Working Group on Maritime Security, and the Security African Regulatory Body on PMSC, they were all attendees, and ultimately the document that came out of it had some interesting implications for how international law can apply to the functioning of PMSCs. What are responsible business practices in complex environments that may kind of subvert the use of a large number of PSCs in these regions, right? So from that, in the past 5 years, China has learned a lot. And I think whatever 30, 40, as you mentioned, Chinese PSCs operate abroad, they strictly attempt to follow the Montreux document and the objectives achieved at the CUPL conference. So yeah, and of course, as a member of the UNSC, China has been frequently engaged in negotiations surrounding the gray area that is operation of PMSCs. And like I said, the peacekeeping thing is a real bone in the broth for China. So again, it has its vital security interests under concern, which largely includes the protection of its personnel. But yeah, I think that's what it basically looks like. So Amit, thank you so very much for your insights on this particular topic. I believe Wagner mutiny kind of showed the internal downsides or the political downsides for the warring parties, but at the same time, how it was put down was covered from different perspectives, and of course brought to light the question of how some of the most affected countries or countries that were thinking about it the most, like China, also started thinking about their own PMSC structure. Any final thoughts, Amit?
No, that was it was great talking to you, Anushka. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and thanks to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy. Have a good day.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.